Hey everyone, welcome to Reflections, the wisdom of Edgar Cayce. We're coming to you courtesy of our broadcasting partner, moretalk.tv. And joining us today on the show is Andrew Collins. Andrew is a science and history writer and the author of various books that challenge the way we perceive the past. His book, Beneath the Pyramids, chronicles his discovery of hidden chambers beneath the pyramids, which was, of course, discussed extensively in the Edgar Cayce readings. And his newest book, Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods, in which he explores this fantastic megalithic complex. And he also links it to the Garden of Eden, which is incredibly fascinating. You can learn more about Andrew and his work at andrewcollins.com. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us on Reflections today.
That's my pleasure.
Absolutely. And I know you have your latest book out. It's entitled Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. And I'm curious, what was the process like writing this book? How did it come about?
Well, the area of study, which basically revolves around southeast Turkey, is something which has been something I've been interested in for the last 25 years. It's an area which I've been looking at very closely relating to the origins of civilization. It's the place that is considered to be the cradle of civilization. It's also where the Neolithic revolution began, the revolution in architecture, yeah, but also more importantly in agriculture and animal husbandry, and the whole changing of the lifestyle from the hunter-gatherer to the more permanent sedentary lifestyle, which took place sometime a little after 9000 BC. And what I'd always said in books like From the Ashes of Angels and Gods of Eden is that there seemed to be some kind of elite behind this great change, one that seemed to involve shamans adorned in feather coats, most obviously that of the vulture, which is the primary symbol of death and rebirth in the early Neolithic world. And that these individuals seem to be remembered very strongly in myth and legend under the name the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, which is a Hebrew text, the oldest versions of which go back to the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they date probably around 200 BC, but also in Mesopotamia, amongst the civilizations of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, where these very same individuals seem to be referred to under the name Anunnaki. And I felt that the Anunnaki and the Watchers, and obviously their offspring, and what they gave humanity, as the texts tell us, is a memory of the events that took place in southeast Turkey at the time of the Neolithic Revolution. And, you know, I was looking very closely in this area. And then in the year 2000, it was announced the discovery of this place called Gobekli Tepe. And essentially this was this incredible complex of stone circles, the oldest megalithic monuments anywhere in the world. I mean, I often compare them to like our own Stonehenge in England, but multiplied by 20 times at least. And the stones covered in beautiful carvings, reliefs of animals and other creatures of the natural world. And many of them also shaped into abstract human form, and with abstract heads, which are just simply T-shaped terminations. And if you can imagine all of these placed upon a mountaintop in southeast Turkey, at a date which is confirmed through radiocarbon dating evidence and other forms of dating to roughly around 9000, 9500 BC, precisely in the time frame that we know the Neolithic Revolution took place. And you realize that this is the smoking gun that we've been looking for, that here is the greatest clues that we will find, not just to the origins of our own civilization, but very likely the evidence of a previous civilization, a lost civilization that once existed somewhere in the ancient world. And the survivors of it ended up in southeast Turkey and kick-started this revolution, this great change that ends up with everything we have today as our own civilization.
Right. That's amazing. And what has the reaction been to your book?
The reaction appears to be very, very positive all round. I mean, it is
Great.
the only real book on Gobekli Tepe that's easily available. I mean, obviously, there are a few others that have come out here and there, been specialist books and whatever, academic things like that. But this is the first popular book on the subject. And, for the first time, people can read not only about the actual architecture, the descriptions of all the different stones and how it was discovered, but also I answer the questions like why it was created, who created it, and what the impact was on myth and legend from that point onwards. And that's the entirety of the book, really. And there's much to go through, and hopefully we can talk about at least some of that in this interview here.
Yeah, absolutely. There's so much to talk about. I want to start with who created it. This is very fascinating to me because it's like you said, it could potentially have roots in a lost civilization that is not discussed. So what did you find about who created Gobekli Tepe?
Well, the first thing I think we've got to say is that almost certainly the people that actually did the construction and the carving and probably the quarrying or whatever were local people, people that were up to this point hunter gatherers, would have worked in small groups, providing food and well-being for their family and probably an extended social group, probably working no more in 15 to 20 in any particular community. And their lives would have been pretty nomadic. They would have followed the herds around. They would have taken what animals they wanted at particular times of the year, and that was that. And yet, suddenly, around 9500 BC, you have this huge change where not just hundreds, but probably thousands of people got together for the first time, seemingly in human history, and began to supersize their cult buildings, their religious structures, their sacred sanctuaries in a manner which had, in theory, never been seen before. So, although the evidence from the type of carving and the idea of using blocks and stones and things like that was already in existence within the Middle East at this time, at places like Jericho, for instance, which is obviously much further south in the Levant area, it does seem as if there was some kind of impetus, and that impetus seems to have come from a group that arrived in this area, and all the best evidence that I can uncover would suggest that they came from the north, and that they were a group that archaeology refers to as the Swiderians. Now, this might be a term which a lot of viewers may never have come across, but these people were part of a long tradition that goes back at least to about 30,000 years ago, to a high culture that existed mostly in Eastern and Central Europe, and that these people, as early as 30,000 years ago, had everything from agriculture, a well-formed mother goddess cult. It seems like they were the earliest astronomers. It seems like they also had tailored clothing, and they had very specific forms of shamanism focused around key animals associated with the sky. And these included the swan, which is a symbol of the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, the wolf, which seems to be the wolf or the fox, I should say, which are symbols of what's known as the cosmic trickster. This figure in the sky that can cause catastrophe and change, and you have to be on your guard about. But also, their other most important symbol was the reindeer. This seems to have been a symbol of the universe as a whole, and that would seem to have been seen as some kind of creator, if you like, in a creator role. I mean, obviously there are other animals and totems and things that were important to them, but they brought all of these ideas with them into southeast Turkey. And this is very important because I think that when they arrived, these people looked completely different to the locals. I think that they were extremely tall. They had elongated heads. They had very long, striking faces that may have almost been described as serpent-like in appearance. Um, they may have been quite pale because they lived in the north, in much colder climates. And there's evidence that they were human hybrids. Now, I don't mean alien hybrids here. I mean that they were an admixture of two different types of humans. One, our own ancestors, Homo sapiens, or anatomically modern humans, but also Neanderthals, our distant cousins, who are often written off as ugly, brutish, ignorant figures who was almost like a cul-de-sac, a wrong turning in humanity. But the more we find out about them, the more we realize that they were just as intelligent as the human beings, the Homo sapiens of their period, and that at the end of their time here on Earth, which probably comes all the way down to about 30,000 years ago, that they may well have passed on a lot of knowledge and information, not just verbally through teachings, but through the fact that they mated with human beings or Homo sapiens and created a hybrid culture. And this hybrid culture was extremely advanced because it had all of the survival and rationality of us as human beings, but suddenly into the mix were all of these ideas to do with spirituality and sacredness and the importance of dreams and connections with nature, which had never been there before. And the bringing together of this created a type of hybrid being that was far more in advance than probably other types of communities. And I think that it was some of these people that came into southeast Turkey. The Swiderians certainly were hybrids. There's been anatomical evidence discovered which absolutely shows that this was the case, that they had these long heads. And that the impact of them was remembered for a very long time, many, many thousands of years, until eventually they were described under names like the Watchers of the Book of Enoch, the Anunnaki of Mesopotamian tradition, but also the angels. These are the origins of human angels. You know, I mean, most people have ideas of angels as these angelic beings with wings that flutter down from heaven. But the earliest angels, as described in the religious texts, had no wings whatsoever. In fact, there is evidence that they wore feather coats, just like the shamans of the early Neolithic. So it looks like these people had a massive impact. They brought their astronomy, they brought their ideas. But of course, the big question becomes, how did they convince the local population to chuck in their free lifestyle as hunter-gatherers with, to be honest, no real worries in the world, in theory, other than providing for their families on a day-to-day basis? How did they convince them to change their lifestyle and settle down in this way? And the answer seems to be something which visionary writer Barbara Han Clough referred to as catastrophobia. Now, this is the fear of catastrophe, the fear that some kind of cataclysm is always about to take place. And the reason why this would have been there shortly before the time of Gobekli Tepe is because there had been a major cosmic event around 10,900 BC. And this almost certainly involved a comet which came into the inner solar system, probably passed around the sun, and then broke into thousands of pieces and which was sent on a trajectory straight towards the Earth. And that once they reached the Earth, they created these incredible, nuclear-like explosions, which devastated large parts of the Earth with wildfires, sending up this ash cloud into the upper atmosphere at the same time that some of the remaining ice sheets were vaporized by fragments of this comet, which were also sent up into the upper atmosphere. The sun was blocked out for a period of time. Who knows how long that was? It could have been years. rain would then have fallen, which would have been a type of acid rain, because it would have included the chemicals from the ash, from the wildfires. And also, what was probably worst of all was the re-triggering of the ice age, which up to that point had been on the receding, that the ice sheets had been, going back, and the climate had warmed. Suddenly, there was an incredible drop in temperature, which triggered this ice age, which lasted for 1,300 years, right the way through until 9,600 BC. In other words, just before the time of Gobekli Tepe. And the other thing is that ice core samples from Greenland and other evidence tells us that this wasn't an event that took place in one day or 1 month or even 1 year, but that there were repercussions and other events going on possibly for several hundred years afterwards. This was a terrible time to live, and that you can understand how, even by the time that we come to the building of Gobekli Tepe, these people would have still lived in fear that these cataclysms would take place every time a comet appears in the sky, because that would obviously have been the omen, the sign of this, of any coming catastrophe for them. And the one thing that we know is that comets have universally been seen as the tails of canids, supernatural canids associated with the concept of tricksters, most obviously foxes or occasionally wolves. And the most famous wolf in this position is Fenris, the wolf of Norse mythology, which was said to have brought darkness and destruction to the world during the so-called Ragnarok, or doom of the gods. That even, it said, many of the gods themselves were killed during this time. Humanity was brought to its knees with only a few people surviving. This is, written up. This is there, and there are similar accounts all the way across Europe, right the way into Southwest Asia, into the area around Gobekli Tepe. And indeed, we know that this cataclysm affected the area around Gobekli Tepe because there is a thick layer of ash that's been found not only in Europe but in Egypt, parts of Russia, in even as far as Australia. But we know that it was also there in Southwest Asia, within 100 miles or so of Gobekli Tepe, which contains what they call extraterrestrial material, or which seems to suggest that it was the result of some kind of impact with something like a comet, and it's exactly the time frame of the suggested date of this terrible event, which is around 10,900 BC. So it's my belief that these people came into the area of southeast Turkey, these strange looking people, these tall people with these long heads, long faces, very striking in appearance. So having an admixture of both Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, and that they said to the locals, look, we understand you're suffering from this catastrophophobia. We understand that you fear every time a comet appears in the sky, you think something bad's going to happen. We can give you the solution to this if you listen to what we have to say. And that solution involved the construction of large-scale monuments for the first time in human history. And the reason why they were constructed, they virtually acted as stargates, as gateways, linking this world, and particularly the shamans that would have been involved with these processes, with accessing otherworldly environments. Call it the sky world if you want. You could even call it heaven if you wanted. Going into some kind of otherworldly realm and countering the actions of these cosmic tricksters, the sky fox, the sky wolf, or indeed, obviously, any other creature that they felt was responsible for these cataclysms. And if you look into ethnology and the history of shamanism, you'll find that one of the duties of the shaman is to quite literally make sure that the world continues to exist, that nothing does affect it and cause the collapse of the so-called sky pole that holds up the heavens, not only bringing the end of the world, but the end of time itself. And these beliefs continued probably all the way through from the early Neolithic, where they were probably already, quite old. They'd probably been in existence during the much earlier Paleolithic times, and that they continued to exist right the way through until the last couple of hundred years. And who knows, somewhere out there in Siberia, there's probably that shamans still doing things like this today. That's why Gobekli Tepe was constructed. There's many more subtleties behind it, which maybe we can come into, to do with the art and the shape of it, looking like a human womb, and it's and the whole concept of the transmigration of the soul. The fact that it would seem as if these enclosures that include these stone circles would seem to have targeted a particular star in the sky. And this was the setting of Deneb, and that's the brightest star in the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, often seen as a swan, but in Southwest Asia, it was a vulture. And this was a symbol of the transmigration of the soul from this world into the next, and its return back into this world. And it seems as though this is one of the reasons why the shamans would adorn themselves in cloaks of feathers, because they believe that they transform themselves, just like the human soul in death, into that of a bird, so that they could access these other worlds. And it would seem as if the main point of entrance into the sky world was via the Cygnus constellation, and the fact that it was positioned exactly on the Milky Way, where the Milky Way breaks in two to form two separate streams. This part of the Milky Way is known as the Great Rift, or the Cygnus Rift, and it becomes like a fork. It splits into this fork, and this fork has universally been seen as a point of entry and exit to the sky world, probably since Paleolithic times, maybe 17,000 years, arguably even 30,000 years. So all of these things come together at Gobekli Tepe, and that's the main premise of the book. And it's a complex thing that we're still missing great parts of the jigsaw, but I think we're getting along the right track.
Andrew, thank you so much. That was all incredibly fascinating. And I feel like we've only scratched the surface on your new book and what you found at Gobekli Tepe. So we're going to take a quick commercial break, and we'll be right back with more from Andrew Collins here on Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And welcome back to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. On the show today is Andrew Collins, and we're talking about Gobekli Tepe and the research that he's done on the location. Andrew, we were talking a lot about the shamanistic aspects of Gobekli Tepe and what you found out about the people who were there, and also what the purpose of what this site was used for. You talk a lot about the womb-like nature of Gobekli Tepe and how it relates to the shamanistic practices. Can you go a little more into that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's switch for a second to Egypt. In Egypt, for instance, we're all familiar with the idea that the pharaoh, or indeed, anybody really of any status, was placed within a coffin, and that coffin itself was placed within a sarcophagus, and that sarcophagus was placed within a tomb, which is obviously a dark place that's created out of stone generally. And often that tomb was inside another structure like a pyramid. And all of these, the coffin, the tomb, the sarcophagus, and even the pyramid, all of them in many ways represent the same thing, and that's the womb. The womb that's considered to be the foundation point of humanity itself. In other words, yes, we come from heaven, we come from, the sky world, whatever concept you want to see it as, or even the underworld. Obviously, various Native American tribes see it as an underworld environment. But the sense is that we come from this cosmic womb, and therefore we must return to it in death. And so the way that ancient cultures would achieve this is to create an environment for the dead body that looked like a womb. I mean, whether it be an oval within, within a rock situation, generally within a cave, and obviously a cave is very womb-like in appearance. But the idea was that in this way, the transformation of the soul, the transmigration of the soul, could easily take place. And it was believed that this cosmic womb had a place of access, and that access would seem to have been in the area of the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird. And the different forms of this celestial bird are very often the soul birds that are most strongly associated with the transmigration of the soul. The swan, for instance, a bird which migrates every year, and in many different cultures, particularly in Europe and Asia, was seen to carry the souls to a northerly placed sky world when it migrated north, and when it came south, it would bring new souls into the world, very much like the concept of the stork bringing new babies into the world. Well, we in our eye see that as a stork with some kind of cloth with a baby tied into it that's delivered into a house. But many thousands of years ago, it would have been the soul that was being delivered, not the actual baby. And in the Baltic, even to this day, it's considered that the swan is what brings babies into the world. And there are similar ideas around the world. The bird is replaced, whether it be the crane, obviously things like the eagle and stuff like this play the same role. And these are creatures which the ancient Greeks referred to as psychopomps. This is a term that means soul carrier or soul accompanier, which means that the bird either becomes the soul or the soul is accompanied by these birds as they make their flight into the next world. And in the area around Gobekli Tepe, the main bird associated with this was the vulture. And the vulture's a bird that's very strongly associated with death and rebirth, not only because of the way that it feeds on death, but the fact is that the most efficient way of disposing of dead bodies in the past, in the Neolithic period, was so-called sky burials, something that Native Americans still do, or certainly did until recently, and it's still practiced in certain parts of the Himalayas by Tibetan Buddhists, for instance. And this is the idea that the bodies on death are placed out generally on platforms, wooden platforms away from communities, and the vultures will come down and they'll clean the bones. And then other birds will actually come down afterwards, the ravens, the blackbirds, and whatever, and then we'll finish it off. And then eventually the bones are collected and put into what's known as a secondary burial. Well, this was certainly something that was present in the early Neolithic. Not always, but it was there. And this bred a belief in the fact that the vulture was itself accompanying the soul away from the dead body and taking it into the next world, which is why the shamans would adorn themselves in these cloaks and feathers, particularly that of the vulture. So coming back to Gobekli Tepe, not only do we find images of the vulture there, I mean, there's even a stone which is today referred to commonly as the vulture stone because it has so many vultures on it, but it also shows the transmigration of the soul on it. You have a headless body, which is a representative of the skeleton, basically, that's now lost its soul, and higher up on a different register is a ball, which is a universal symbol of the soul, or the head, as in the skull, the seat of the soul, on one of the wings of this vulture, as if the vulture's carrying the soul into the next world. And for this to be fulfilled properly, it was, I think, believed at Gobekli Tepe that the enclosures had to be womb-like in appearance. They had to be oval in shape. And what's interesting is that various of them seem to have exactly the same proportion: 5 one way, and then 4 of the same unit the other way. 5 by 4 is a proportion, or 4 by 5. And what I found is that this is quite interesting, because this is very often the proportion of the human womb and also the human placenta. And I think that there's a lot of subtleties in here. I mean, the name Göbekli itself means navel, as in the middle of the belly. The navel is connected to the umbilical cord, which itself obviously is linked to the placenta. And obviously this is the lifeline, for a child, for a fetus before birth. And I think that a lot of these ideas were brought in to the design of these structures, because it was believed that the more birth-like that they could appear, the more easily the shaman would be able to make that transition from this world to the next. So it was a part of a process which they believed was necessary to allow the shaman, or indeed the soul. I mean, we don't know what else was going on there. There may even have been births taking place there, because there is some hint of some kind of female cult going on there that may even have involved, either conception or birth taking place within the enclosures themselves. So this is, a really intriguing area, but it's almost like a sideline from the main function of the enclosures, which was to allow the shamans access to the other world in order to deal with these supernatural or cosmic tricksters that they believed threatened the world and that could bring cataclysm.
Right. Wow, that's so fascinating. And I think it's obvious when you discuss this that the people in Gobekli Tepe had a wonderful cosmological knowledge, but it makes me wonder, and did you find in your research, where did this knowledge come from? Where did they get the idea to lay out Gobekli Tepe and, of course, have the shamanistic rituals that took place there?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, it seems as though the people that brought this knowledge, seemingly from the north, probably via the Caucasus region, which is somewhere very important to the readings of Edgar Cayce, is that these people were part of a much older tradition that goes back at least to 30,000 years or more. And it would seem as if there are highly advanced cultures existing, particularly in the area of central Russia, on the Don River, for instance, which is a major river that flows south into the area of the Crimea. And also, this same culture, high culture, existed just to the west of the Carpathian Mountains in Central Europe, in the country that we now know as the Czech Republic. There were extremely advanced communities existing at both of these places. And I cite these as examples. Almost certainly there are many others that either have not been uncovered or we don't know enough about yet. And, these, as I said, these are the earliest astronomers. They would seem to have understood the stars and associated different animals with them and shamanism as early as 30,000 BC. And that's an important date, because that's also the date that our distant cousins, the Neanderthals, disappear from the scene. And what's evident is that in the very areas where these high cultures rise up had formerly been the communities of Neanderthals. And there is some evidence which is now making much more sense with the more and more DNA evidence that we have, that a part of all of us is a very small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, is the fact that these transitional communities, it's almost like, there was the Neanderthals, then the Homo sapiens came along, there was some kind of, mating going on, and the communities gradually shifted until they became hybrid, and that those hybrids were probably quite superior in their intelligence than either of the individual types of human that existed prior to that time. So I think a lot of these ideas came from this hybridization. And this is something which, we're only now in the last probably 5 years able to talk about, and it to sound even plausible, because we have the DNA evidence coming in. And whereas obviously in the past, to make these sort of statements would have been almost anathema, particularly to anthropology and science in general, because it was believed that the human being, us, Homo sapiens sapiens, are advanced, and we did it all ourselves, and that our distant cousins were just wrong turnings of humanity, like the Neanderthal or the Homo erectus or any of these other earlier versions of humanity. But no, all of them played a vital part in the build-up to the creation of us today. And although we might not be able to see them in ourselves anymore, as I said, we are the product of what was there in the past. I don't believe that there was any kind of aliens involved necessarily. I mean, if there was alien contact, I don't think it was on a physical level. There may have been some mental contact with non-terrestrial intelligences. I don't necessarily think we're looking at some kind of Atlantean civilization that was completely devastated and seeded every other civilization around the world, which was the belief of Ignatius Donnelly in 1882 with his book Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. I do believe that there was an Atlantis, but that's a separate story. But what I believe is that that the high culture is there. That lost civilization was there, but we just haven't recognised just how important these people were as early as 30,000 years ago. And the reason for this is the Darwinian concept of evolution, because
Right.
we believe that we are the best thing that's been created through evolution yet, and that the further back in time, the more ignorant we were. And that doesn't seem to have been the case. Yes, we're roughly always heading in the same direction, but there are cycles, and those cycles can often be brought to a close, just as Plato tells us in the story of Atlantis. They can be brought to a close by cataclysm, by fire and by flood, and various other types of cataclysm, earthquakes or volcanoes or whatever, can all stall the process of evolution at certain times. And I believe that a lot of the inventions that we have today, perhaps even metallurgy, for instance, is something that our ancestors probably knew about, but it wasn't universal. It was knowledge and wisdom held by certain cultures, and that when they were wiped out, that knowledge was not passed on into future generations. So it had to be reinvented again.
Right. Absolutely. This is also wonderfully fascinating. Thank you. What we're going to do is we're going to take another quick break, but we're going to be right back with more from Andrew Collins as we talk about Gobekli Tepe here on Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. And welcome back to Reflections, the Wisdom of Edgar Cayce. Joining me on the show today is Andrew Collins, and we are talking about the wonderfully fascinating topic of Gobekli Tepe and his research done. I wanted to talk a little bit about the connection that you made in your book with Genesis and the Garden of Eden, which I think a lot of listeners will be very fascinated to see these connections that you made. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, in 2007, Professor Klaus Schmidt, who sadly died within the last month, who was the German archaeologist that almost single-handedly resurrected Göbekli Tepe in the 1990s by going there and realizing its significance and beginning excavations there, which kept him busy right the way through until this year, when he died. In 2007, he linked the Gobekli Tepe complex with the Garden of Eden. I mean, he even sort of threw away the remark that it was almost like a temple in Eden itself. And this is a very interesting statement and a very important one, because this area, as I wrote in books like From the Ashes of Angels, in the middle of the 1990s, is the traditional site of the Garden of Eden. And what I mean by that is that although most people might get the idea that the Garden of Eden or paradise is something which is ethereal or intangible or incorporeal for us, physical mortals, simply because Adam and Eve were thrown out of there, and humanity are not supposed to return. There are lots of clues given in the book of Genesis, and in other early texts, that tell us quite clearly that it was a physical place, and that it was somewhere in the Near East, and that it says, for instance, that the 4 rivers of paradise, 2 of which can be easily identified as the Euphrates and the Tigris, these 4 rivers were supposed to be the point, well, where they rise is the point where the Garden of Eden was. And if you look at these 4 rivers, it takes you into the area of eastern Turkey, just about 100 to maximum 200 miles away from Gobekli Tepe. And in fact, the river Euphrates flows very close to Gobekli Tepe. And this was the traditional Garden of Eden. And I actually even discovered that there was a monastery here in eastern Turkey where the monks believed that their foundation actually was created on some quiet corner of the Garden of Eden, the terrestrial paradise. And they even had a piece of what they believed to be the Tree of Life, which had originated in theory, or certainly been grown from the tree that was within the terrestrial paradise itself, and could bestow immortality upon anything that came into contact with it, whether it be human beings, so to speak, or animals, or other plant life, or whatever. And they actually had a holy relic that they believed to be a piece of this tree, which, obviously, as to what exactly they had, we'll never know now, because unfortunately this monastery, which I call the Eden Monastery, but it's actually officially called Yugadat, and it was actually on the northern slopes of the eastern Taurus Mountains, overlooking what's known as the Plain of Mush, M-U-S, which I would say is probably the best candidate by far for the actual, Eden itself as a concept, like a plane. And so, these beliefs were very strong. But you've got to say to yourself, well, okay, we understand about this, but what has any of this got to do with Gobekli Tepe? I mean, Gobekli Tepe was created perhaps 9,500 years before Christianity, and many thousands of years before even the advent of the Semitic or Hebrew religion. So what is the relationship? Well, as I said, the key word here is impact, because shortly after Gobekli Tepe was created, we had what's known as the Neolithic Revolution, and this was the advent of agriculture, the domestication of wheat and rye and barley, for instance, and obviously the earliest animal domestication, pigs, sheep, goats, cattle. All of these animals were domesticated in this region for the first time approximately around 9,000 or just after 9,000 BC. And this meant a complete change of life. People who had been hunter-gatherers before, could do what they want, suddenly they now were part of communities. there were taskmasters. They had to get up at a certain time of day and go to bed at a certain time of day to get up early again the next day. This was the beginning of a cycle of life which most of us today still are a part of. And I think that this transition from the hunter-gatherer age, what you might call the golden age, if you like, in other words, the period where we were free to do what we wanted, to this hierarchical age where, you know, we're generally under the control of others for the most part of our lives, is very much symbolic of the story of Adam and Eve. You know, the idea that Adam and Eve, as the first representatives of humanity, lived, you know, this free lifestyle. You know, they didn't have to worry about food, they didn't have to worry about death, they didn't have to worry about hunger or anything. And then suddenly the serpent appears, and this serpent, by the way, is often linked with the Watchers in early Hebrew texts. For instance, in the book of Enoch that talks about the Watchers, it's even said that this serpent was a watcher, and the Watchers are often referred to as like walking serpents, basically, generally because of their appearance, the long faces, viper-like faces, and that. But anyway, so the serpent gives Adam and Eve this forbidden fruit. They eat it, and suddenly their innocence is gone, and they realise that they're naked, as if they'd never noticed that they were naked before. And this realization, this loss of innocence, this loss of this purity of life which they had, meant that they could no longer experience the tree of life. The benefits of the tree of life, which was immortality, but even stay within the garden itself. The garden representing the ancient golden age. So they're now thrown out and made to till the land forever. And obviously, what is tilling the land? I mean, it's agriculture. And although we are told, or not we're told, but we believe that the forbidden fruit is something like a nice shiny red apple, that's not what the book of Genesis tells us at all. In fact, it doesn't say what the fruit is. And some old accounts tell us that fruit was in fact wheat. And I think that is a really, really, really important realization, that wheat changed everything. Once the Neolithic Revolution kicked in, our lives were never, ever going to be the same. And I think that, you know, this is when everything changed. That's where the loss of innocence was more a case of a loss of freedom. And I'm afraid that, you know, we feel the effects of this even today. You know, most of us have to get up at a certain time, work, and we have taskmasters, you know, the managers in the office, all the rest of it. Things changed at that point. And that, I think, is the story that's recorded in abstract form within the book of Genesis, in the story of Adam and Eve.
Right. Wow. That's incredible. These connections you found, and of course they're all in your book, are just amazing. It was so fascinating to study up on all of them. Your research obviously challenges the traditional idea of evolution, or the traditional idea of civilization as we know it, as we teach it in our schools. What are your thoughts on this, and what do you see your research and the research of other scholars like Graham Hancock? How do you see that playing a role in the future to maybe change our idea of civilization?
Well, it's a slow process, isn't it? I mean,
Right.
you know, the type of material that Graham Hancock or myself write is non-academic. And what I mean by that is that we are not scholars, we're not academics, so we cannot write as, you know, to in a way which, you know, could end up in scholarly books. But we write in a scholarly fashion, in fact, sometimes probably even more detail than our, you know, academic colleagues. We have to be, for people to take us seriously. And the ideas that we're putting forward now will go into the collective consciousness and will probably come back at us from the academic books in about 20 years' time, as if they've discovered them themselves. And this is unfortunately always the way that it works.
Right.
And I mean, I'll give you an example. A gentleman by the name of Stan Goosh, who was a psychologist wrote a number of books in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s. I mean, he died in the 2000s about Neanderthals, and that they were far more intelligent than what we've ever given credit, and that humanity today is the product of the admixture of Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, so-called Cro-Magnon man. And people laughed at him. They just thought he was stupid. And everything that he was saying then is now being confirmed by science. DNA evidence is showing us the whole relationship between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. And also, it's showing that the Neanderthals were incredibly intelligent, and that we should never look at them as anything less intelligent than the human beings that coexisted with them towards the end. And so, that's that. But will he get credit from the academics? Probably not. Will I get credit from the academics? Probably not officially, no. And that's just the way that it is. But if there are not people like myself and Graham Hancock and Robert Schoch and people like that, who obviously is an academic, these ideas will never be put out into the mainstream in the first place. So
Right.
we play a role, and that's a role which is both personal, one of discovery and exploration, which, we've been, for our sins, we do. And the other, I think, is the dissemination of knowledge and wisdom, which takes much, much longer and is much more frustrating, because sometimes you think that you're knocking your head against a brick wall, that nobody seems to be listening. And then eventually new discoveries are made, and you feel that, yeah, I was on the right track when I wrote that book back in the 1990s. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
Therefore, I feel
absolutely.
confident to write, more of the same type of ideas and take it on to the next stage.
Absolutely. Well, please don't stop. From this one person, I'm enjoying your research. It's been incredibly fascinating to
Very much.
connect all these dots. The last thing I want to kind of touch on is you're a speaker at the annual Ancient Mysteries conference here at the A.R.E, and I know you've been a speaker in the past. What has your experience been like at the Ancient Mysteries conference, and what do you expect for this upcoming conference?
Well, I mean, my experiences at the A.R.E are always beautiful. I mean, I really look forward to coming to Virginia Beach. I love the place. I love the centre. I love the people, and I look forward to being there in October. But what's always important when you give lectures there is to show the relationship between what you're saying and the readings of Edgar Cayce. That's almost like the complementary side of the work that you do. And here we have more evidence that Edgar Cayce was correct. Because he talks about a high culture existing in Egypt around Giza in 10,500 BC. He believed that this was created through the fact that there'd been a cataclysm which had devastated the world and caused remnants of Atlantis and other types of peoples to come together in Egypt and create this early civilization. But the person who led this civilization was a figure by the name of Rata. And Rata and his people are said to have come in from the area of the Caucasus. And the Caucasus is on the very edge of what we know today as Eastern Turkey. So what he's saying is that the inspiration behind the elder culture of ancient Egypt actually came from the very area that I'm saying that these people came into, the area of Gobekli Tepe, and created civilization. And obviously we know that they wouldn't have stopped there. Once this had flowered, they would have then moved on and ended up in places like Egypt and lower Mesopotamia, and obviously places like the Indus Valley, and of course into Europe itself. So here we have further evidence that Edgar Cayce was not only right, but is relevant to today.
Right, absolutely. Well, I encourage everybody to go out and get your latest book. It's just filled with tons of connections like the ones you've made today on the show. So I thank you for writing that. As a final question, I just wanted to ask you personally, what's next on your agenda as a researcher?
Well, I mean, obviously, once you do something like this, it's difficult to let go of it, and your work really is almost a stepping stone away from what you've been working now, and I want to take it back. Gobekli Tepe was 9,500 BC. I want to look very, very closely at the high cultures, maybe even the lost civilization that came to bear on the construction of Gobekli Tepe itself. And I think that the key words for the future, in all honesty, will be human hybrids. I think that's where it's going massively with, skull elongation, the admixtures of different types of people that's coming up with DNA evidence. And that's where I think I'd be going next, to try and understand fully what was taking place as much as 50,000 years ago, possibly even earlier than that, all the different steps that eventually brings us Göbekli Tepe.
Right. Wow. We'll look forward to that. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really been an honor to have you on the show. And please continue to do what you're doing. And we look forward to seeing you here at the A.R.E. at the annual Ancient Mysteries Conference in October. So
I
thank
look
you so
forward.
much for joining me.
Okay, I look forward to it as well. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. Andrew Collins is a featured presenter, as we talked about, at the A.R.E.'s annual Ancient Mysteries Conference, and that's in Virginia Beach at the A.R.E. headquarters, and it's from October 9th through the 12th of this year. This year's event is entitled Mystery of Mysteries, Forgotten Worlds, Strange Myths, and Hidden Origins. Andrew is joined by Erich von Däniken, John Anthony West, John Van Auken, Susan B. Martinez, and many, many more speakers. You can get fascinating insights and see vibrant images of lost cultures, hidden histories, and enigmatic places and creatures from across the globe, from ancient Sumeria and Egypt to the stars. You can register for this conference at edgarcayce.org/conferences. Space is limited for the annual Ancient Mysteries Conference, so make sure you register now because it sells out every year. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Andrew's latest book entitled Gobekli Tepe, Genesis of the Gods. You can learn more about Andrew and his work at andrewcollins.com. On behalf of everyone here at the Association for Research and Enlightenment and moretalk.tv, I'm your host, Brenton Bickerstaff, reminding you that we are all searching for the same light, and always remember to support others on their unique path. Thank you for tuning in this week, and have a wonderful week, everybody. Now it's time for the Thought for the Day. And joining us this week on the Thought for the Day is again Dr. Bill Austin. Bill, thank you so much for joining us on Reflections.
My pleasure, Brenton. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Pleasure to have you on. And if you can go ahead and read the Thought for the Day today.
All right. This one comes from reading 3292-1. You only fail if you quit trying. The trying is oft counted for righteousness. Remember, as he has given, I do not condemn thee. Go be patient, be kind, and the Lord be with you. I don't know about anyone else, but there are times in my life, sometimes it feels like it's daily, sometimes it feels like it's moment to moment, where I get frustrated and just want to give up and quit and think, I'm just not getting it. I'm not getting anywhere. Just the stress of everyday life can sometimes feel like it's really mounting. And sometimes I feel like, boy, I've made some colossal mistakes. I've made some errors that could never be forgiven. And, this saying says, I do not condemn thee. I think that helps to remind me that our essence for everyone is purely divine, and it's still one with our Creator, and we're as perfect as our Creator. We're an extension of our Creator, who is perfect, and all I think we're expected to do is to keep trying and keep coming back. And on this physical plane, if we can learn how to be patient, how to be kind to one another, we've learned a tremendous lesson. These are the attributes, for me, these are the attributes of our Creator. That's what we would experience, and that experience would be given back to us. As we're kind and patient with others, we'll receive that kindness and patience from our Lord.
Right. Absolutely. That's great. I love this one. It's really loaded. This one has a lot of great stuff to it. And you were talking a lot about patient and kindness. And Casey talked a lot about ideals. And I think if there were two ideals that would be ones to really cling to, it would be patience and kindness. They seem so simple, but they really are something that's, overlooked in society a lot. But we don't stress that enough. It's not something that they necessarily teach in school. It's something that, you have to either pick up along the way or something you decide to take on yourself. But those are two, to me, some of the most powerful ideals. And you said it yourself, how the more patience and kindness you practice and put out in your day-to-day interaction, you're going to get it back. It's a law. Casey stated very clearly that it's a law, and that law never falters. The other thing I like about this reading is, I do not condemn thee, he mentions in the reading, saying that our Creator, your Lord, whoever your Creator is not condemning. That's not what they're there to do. That's not what the universe is set up for. What we do is we do condemn ourselves. But the thing I love about the Casey readings, one of the things that I gathered that I take with me every day, is not to beat yourself up, not to condemn yourself when you make a misstep, what you deem a misstep. As long as you understand that everything is accounted for, he mentions in this, every bit of progress is always accounted for. Even though you may be beating up on yourself, you got to try to focus less on the negative and try to see more of the things that you are doing right, because it really helps to create, a positive environment that you kind of ripple out into, your day-to-day interaction.
Yes. And when you were talking about being patient and being kind as ideals, if we can keep coming back to that and keep trying
Right.
to be patient and be kind, I think we get better at it.
Right.
And I think that when we're kind, when we're patient, we'll be happy as well.
Absolutely. And I think our body will reflect that happiness. I think when somebody is beating themselves up constantly, I think you can see that reflected in their physical body. When somebody is understanding, having a spiritual ideal, and maybe having that as a reference, and not condemning themselves so much, it creates a lighter environment, both, emotionally and spiritually inside of you, but also physically. It'll reflect, on your, your physical body.
Oh, absolutely. Having taught many classes in anatomy and physiology, in being a chiropractor, I see the results of stress, whether it be
Right.
physical stress, mental, emotional stress, chemical stress that it has upon the body. And it's very destructive.
Absolutely.
And one way of countering that stress is to be kind, be patient, and be happy.
That's great. Bill, thank you so much for joining us for the Thought for the Day again. It's always a pleasure having you on.
Thank you again, Brent. Talk to you next time.
Sounds good.